I just got my new camera, the Sony ZV-E1. And if you followed this channel for a little bit, you might have known that I just had the FX3 on loan from Sony for 3 weeks, and I tested that out and I absolutely love the camera. But before we get into why I chose the ZV-E1 and not the FX3, I first wanted to touch upon why I've decided to switch to Sony from Canon after shooting with Canon for I think more than 5 years, originally starting in photography and then moving to videography later on when I became a full-time content creator or filmmaker, or whatever you want to call it. So there are 3 main reasons why I decided to make the switch to Sony. The first one is that they have a series of cameras that are video first, and nowadays I shoot way more video than I do photos. Actually, I primarily shoot videos, and the whole hybrid thing is I still want to be able to shoot photos, but I tend to pretty much always shoot video, and I have a hard time in my brain doing both at the same time anyway, switching between them. My brain is kind of wired to shooting video now. I'm not as good at shooting stills as I used to be. So all of that kind of came together to Sony feeling like the best option with some of those cameras that they had for what I need right now. And the ZV-E1 is very much video first. It's called a vlogging camera and probably not seen as a professional camera for most. But a lot of what I do is run and gun shooting, talking to the camera on YouTube, like all of this stuff. So in that regard, it seems like a pretty good option, but we'll get to that in a second, as I said. So video first is the first thing. Then secondly, which is not fully a reason, is the community. There are so many Sony shooters, and I kind of feel like when I was making these YouTube videos that all my Canon stuff was appreciated because there weren't as many talking about Canon. But at the same time, I got a lot of questions about what about S-Log3 and what about S-Log2 and what about these things with Sony and what do you think of this and why are you shooting Canon? And all of these things doesn't really matter too much. I'm shooting the camera that I feel is the best for me, which is now going to be Sony for at least a while. But that whole aspect also just makes it feel exciting to actually be able to shoot and answer some of these questions that I keep getting. And then the next thing is that Sony is very big in helping their creators, working with creators, organizing events, conferences. That's the whole reason I got in contact with Sony in the first place, which led to me borrowing the FX3 and actually the lens that I'm using right now as well for the ZV-E1, because I was invited to a conference by Sony Nordic, and unfortunately I couldn't go, but that kind of led into that. And all the things that they organize and do with creators is something that I would love to be a part of, something that I've never seen Canon do, at least not to the same extent. They mostly work with a couple of ambassadors, and yeah, I just like the way that Sony are doing things. And I know that Lumix are doing sort of the same in the same degree, I think, and other camera brands as well. But yeah, Sony just spoke to me in this way, not literally, but just in terms of what they offer with cameras. And the E-mount is a big thing as well, because I was tired of being on the RF mount on Canon. I think they've finally opened up for third-party lenses, but it's gonna take a while for Sigma and Tamron and everyone else to catch up with lens options for those cameras if they decide to. So yeah, just a lot of pros of going with Sony there, which could have been with Lumix or anything else as well. But Joya, my girlfriend, is already shooting with Sony as well, has the A6400, and we've been shooting with that a lot as well. So it made sense that in the future we can move towards having full-frame cameras, both of us, and shooting with the same lenses. So all of that kind of came together. So I'm not saying that Sony is necessarily better than any other brand. I'm not sponsored by Sony or anything at this point of time. If you choose to shoot with Nikon or with Lumix or with Fuji or with Canon, whatever it might be, all of the different brands have cameras that cater to different features, to different creators, to different types of shooting. And depending on what you need, that might be an option for you as well. And while Lumix could have been an option as well, I just kind of like everything around the Sony cameras and I wanted to try that out. So with these reasons, that's why I made the switch, and shoot with whatever you want and shoot with the camera brand that you feel like is the best for you. I don't really care much of what's between the camera brands themselves. I care about what works for me, and for now, the features that Sony have are what I'm looking at and the capabilities in the cameras. So let's jump into why I chose the ZV-E1 specifically. And the first thing you might have guessed is the price. I wanted the FX3 like crazy. It's my dream camera. I tested it out, still my dream camera. I just cannot afford it at this point in time. The ZV-E1 is half the price and still an expensive camera. I'm not telling you that this is a beginner camera by any means. It is the ultimate vlogging camera category kind of, I think, from Sony. So it has a lot of great features while still being a tiny camera and limited in some ways, but it has the exact same sensor that the FX3 has. And that leads us into the first reason why I chose the ZV-E1, and that is that sensor. I wanted the image quality from the FX3, and while I know I've heard from some of all of you that reach out to me through Instagram, helping me with inputs on the ZV-E1 when I asked on there, have seen some differences between the ZV-E1, the FX3, and the FX6 that has all of them has the same sensor, and that should have something to do with the processing power or something, I think. But I don't think I'm going to be able to see the difference, and I'm not going to be able to test them side by side. So as long as the image quality is going to be fine, and you can judge that for yourself right now, you're looking at the image from it, then I'm happy. The second reason in that same area of the sensor is the dual native ISO. I got a lot of questions. Why not the FX30? Why not the A7S III? Why not I think there was a third camera, or why not other Sony cameras as well? And the main reason is the dual native ISO. Now, the A7S III has the same ones, but this is an older camera, so I'm not sure what they are doing with firmware updates for that and all of those things. And here in New Zealand, where we are now, it was still more expensive than the ZV-E1 that do have some features that seem to be maybe nice to have for this, among some of them that we're going to talk about in a second. So the ultimate decision fell on the ZV-E1. It fit the budget and it fit the features that I wanted. If you want a whole breakdown of me talking about why I chose this and not the other cameras and what I think about individual of them, even though I haven't shot with most of them, just leave a comment down below. If enough of you do it or there's a good reason, then I'm happy to talk about that as well. But now I just want to talk about the features, the cons, and the worries that I have about the ZV-E1. So the next thing is the size. Actually, when I tested out the FX3, I was expecting it to be smaller than the R6 that I had from Canon, because I wanted a lighter setup overall. We are traveling around all the time, all the gear is heavy on the back, all of that. So I wanted something smaller, and it turned out it was the exact same size as the R6, but the camera itself, the camera body itself felt lighter, and the lenses from Sony seems to be lighter as well. So overall it felt lighter to walk around with, and when I compared them side by side. But the ZV-E1 is a tiny camera. I actually laughed when I took it out of the box because it's so tiny. And I used to say that I didn't want to switch to Sony because the camera bodies were so small. I like the grip and the size of the R6 that I have from Canon, and actually I do really like how the FX3 is as well in that regard. But all of that said, I did want a smaller camera and a smaller setup. So in that regard, this is perfect. We're going to get to that in the cons as well, but there is some limitations with the size. But for now, the size is a pro in that regard. It's going to be easier, smaller, lighter to carry around. So for me, that's perfect. Next up is that this camera has the little AI chip inside that the FX3, for example, doesn't have. The A7S III doesn't have that either. And that just improves the autofocus, I think, and allows it to track a lot more things. I probably won't use that as much, but the autofocus is a huge thing. I use that all the time. So that's nice, and that's very good and snappy. All the cool features with moving around and it tracking you on the screen, and I probably won't use that as much. But it's always nice to have. It's always nice to have those new features, and maybe cool updates come as it's still a new camera. So maybe I'll be surprised in the future with what it can do as well. But the tracking overall is a huge thing for me. I love that it's so snappy already from the few test shots that I've done. I can just see that it's super snappy, and I'm not really scared that it's not going to catch focus on me. So that's a huge pro. And then another thing, next pro with that is the stabilization as well. It has the active dynamic stabilization, which does crop in 30%, but I tested it quickly yesterday and it seems pretty crazy for just zooming in, cropping in, and then getting completely steady shots, even though I was walking, just holding the lens in my hand. And yeah, I'm impressed with that. I'm going to test that out a lot more. So those things, price, sensor, size, the AI chip for the tracking and for the stabilization, those are the 5 biggest reasons why I've gotten this. But overall, the majority of that is the dual native ISO, the 12,800 ISO, so it can basically see in the dark, and the image quality. Those are the 2 things that I'm mostly after. The other things are just nice pros to have as well. All right, so that leads us to the 5, not necessarily cons, because I haven't actually tested it out yet, but 5 worries that I have about this camera. The first one is the overheating. That is or seems to be a huge deal around YouTube and reviews. And while I've seen the reviews, it doesn't seem that bad. And when I reached out on Instagram and asked for you guys' help, a lot of you said you had the ZV-E1 and it never overheated on you, unless you shot in like a lot of 120 or long time in 60 frames per second, which is not something I normally do. Occasionally, yes. My biggest worry was for these talking head setups, if it was gonna overheat on me in 30 frames per second, or if I do interview style shoots at some point. Those were my worries, and I don't know if that's gonna happen. I hope not. One of the things that I hated about the R6 was that it overheated so quickly when I started really pushing it. So it's gonna be interesting to see what this does, and that would have been a good reason to get the A7S III or the FX3. I wouldn't get the FX30. But I hope it's not going to be an issue, and yeah, I'll just have to put it to the tests. Maybe I'll do a video where I'm trying to push it a lot, go out, shoot a lot in 120 or 60 and actually see how it handles things, so I know that for the future. But that's one thing that worries me the most. The next con is actually the size, and I mentioned that briefly before, but I love that it's so small, but it's almost too small. Like the grip in my hand, because I have quite long fingers, it's not very pleasant, and it has this little thing sticking out here where you can attach like strap or something like that, probably a strap, to it, and that sticks out a little bit. So when I'm holding it in my hands, it seems to stick a little bit into my hand. So I'm definitely gonna look at getting a cage for it, just to extend that a little bit, make it a little bit bigger so it's a little bit more comfortable to hold. I've seen that SmallRig and Newer makes a cage that has like a silicone grip on it, so just extend that grip out a little bit more. So probably look at one of those. If you have any recommendations, please let me know in the comments, because I haven't decided on anything yet, but I would love to get something like that. So yeah, just feels a little bit better in hands. Next con or worry is the 1 SD card slots. Now, I've always had cameras that had 2 SD card slots, and I've never had an SD cards fail on me. All the knock on wood and everything. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But it's never happened to me before, and that is also a reason why I'm not really that worried about it now. If it does end up happening, that's gonna suck so bad, especially if I lose a lot of footage. But it's just another encouragement, I think, for me to just back up my footage regularly or every day after I've shot and reformat the card anyway. Or I have a lot of cards now because I used to have 2 of them in, and yeah, so I can actually just swap them out sometimes to make sure that I shoot in different cards. Or I don't know, I'm gonna figure out a workflow about that. I'm not too worried about it, but it is a little bit of a concern because I've been used to having 2, and it's just a nice safety to have. The next worry is that it doesn't have as many customizable buttons. And the previous video I released before this one, or published, was me setting up the FX3, and that was kind of because I was expecting to buy the FX3. I was hoping that it would be possible. So I made a whole video how I laid it out, and as one of you guys nicely pointed out, it probably didn't get that many views because those people that have the FX3 already set it up, and not that many people are probably buying it right now. So I've already set this one up because I had a whole day where I didn't have a lens for it, so I just kind of played around with setting it up. So I've done sort of the same layout, but because it has a few less custom buttons, I've set it up a little bit differently. So as I'm testing it out, as I'm tweaking it, if it's not perfect yet, I'll be making a video on that. I think it's going to be a 2-part, one where I'm just showing you how I set it up, and then one where I'm showing you how I actually use it out in the world in practical environment, and those 2 can go together. So I'm going to make that, if you want to see it or not. But that's a little worry of mine as well. Like, does it have enough buttons? I love to customize buttons. If you ask Joya, she's going to say the same. She's like always customizing things. So it's even hard to figure out what all of them do. But yeah, that's just how I love to do it. I'm going to make a video on that. And then the last thing, which is not really a worry, it's just kind of an annoyance if it turns out to be what I hope it's not. And that is that Sony just announced that they are gonna announce a new camera in the ZV series on July 11th. And I bought it basically an entire week before, and that's when the announcement came out as well. So it wasn't gonna change my decision because that camera is probably not available to purchase 1 month or 2 months after, and I needed a camera now. And I'm happy with the features that are in the ZV-E1. But if they come out with like a ZV-E1 F because it has a fan or something, I'm gonna be very sad. So it's not really a worry as much as just be super annoying if they come out with a new camera that beats this. I hope it's going to be somewhere between the ZV-E1 and the ZV-E10. So it's like a mid-range camera between those 2. But yeah, let's see what comes out. It would just be super annoying and super typical to buy a camera and then a new version comes out right after. It is still fairly new, so I hope they're not cannibalizing on that already, but it's Sony. We never know. They come out with new cameras packed with features all the time, which is why this camera is quite incredible already. So with all of that said, this is kind of just me both testing out the image quality for myself in a scenario like this, seeing if it can handle a talking head video, which hopefully it can. So far, so good. And me just talking about what I expect from this camera overall. Now I can put it to the test. If you have anything that you want me to test, check out, talk about in other videos, leave a comment down below because I would love to do so. That's also why I made this video before doing all of that, so I can kind of include whatever you feel like you haven't seen in reviews or videos before, or if there's something specific you would like me to talk about, whether that's about filming with it, rigging it out, which I'm not going to do that much, the colors, the different shooting modes, the different features, whatnot. I want to do more practical tests and shoots and videos moving forward, so that's going to be part of it. But yeah, let me know. And otherwise, I'm just excited to test out this new camera, play around with it, get familiar with it, and just shoot a lot of cool stuff moving forward. Hopefully driving around in a camper van in New Zealand and doing all of that very, very soon. So with all that said, hope you enjoyed the video. I will see you in the next one. And until then, take care.